At her sister's wedding, she was seated apart from everyone else, but after she left, something happened that no one expected. Subscribe and write in the comments, where are you watching this video from? The hum of the tires against the polished asphalt was the only sound inside the car as Aaliyah approached the sprawling gates of the Hawthorne Lake Estate. Her hands, resting stiffly on the steering wheel, betrayed the calm she tried to project. Beyond the high iron gates, the estate sprawled in effortless luxury. Wide green lawns, manicured rose gardens, and marble fountains sparkling in the late afternoon sun. A place so carefully curated, it seemed allergic to anything raw, anything real. A place that had never been meant for her. She had spent 3 days choosing the perfect dress, something simple yet elegant, in muted tones that would not draw attention. The deep emerald gown she wore clung modestly to her frame, highlighting her poise but blending seamlessly into the color palette of the occasion. Her hair, a coiled crown of dark natural curls, had been carefully pinned and smoothed to avoid any excuse for disapproving glances. She had even worn the delicate pearl earrings her mother had gifted her years ago, hoping to stitch some fragile thread of belonging. As her car rolled to a stop at the main gate, a sharply dressed valet approached. He opened the door with a rehearsed smile that faltered ever so slightly when he took in her appearance. Aaliyah's heart twinged, but she smiled with a composed nod, stepping out gracefully onto the cobbled driveway. The late summer air was warm and thick with the scent of lilies and fresh-cut grass. Guests in pastel silks and dark tailored suits milled about the courtyard, champagne flutes catching the light. White faces, polished and perfect, filled the scene like characters from a painting she had always been told she could admire but never truly step into. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and made her way toward the grand entrance of the main hall. The towering doors stood open, framed by heavy garlands of white roses and golden ribbons. Just inside, a registration table awaited, manned by a young woman whose practiced smile froze momentarily as Aaliyah approached. "Name, please?" the woman asked, recovering her professional poise almost immediately. "Aaliyah Monroe," she answered, her voice even. The woman flipped through the seating list, her manicured fingers moving just a little too fast. Aaliyah watched the faint line appear between the woman's brows, the subtle tightening of her mouth. She knew that expression too well. Confusion, discomfort, and then, almost inevitably, dismissal. "Ah, yes," the woman said, forcing another bright smile. "You're seated near the kitchen doors." Aaliyah blinked. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" "Just outside the main banquet hall, near the kitchen," the woman said, as if reciting a line she had been instructed to deliver without room for discussion. She pointed to a side alcove on the seating chart, away from the chandeliers and the head tables where family and close friends were positioned. For a moment, Aaliyah stood frozen, the words stinging sharper than she had anticipated. She searched the chart. Her adoptive parents, Richard and Caroline Monroe, were prominently placed near the bridal party. Emily, the golden child, the blushing bride, was enshrined at the very center, surrounded by her closest friends, all luminous and laughing. The seating plan was a web of privilege and connection, and she, Aaliyah, was pushed to the margins, quite literally. A thin smile stretched across her lips, brittle but intact. Maybe it was a mistake, she thought. Maybe the planner had mixed something up at the last minute. Hope clung stubbornly, even as logic tried to crush it. "Perhaps there's been an error," she said carefully. The woman shook her head with a polite finality. "I'm afraid not. That's the assigned spot." There was no malice in her tone, only the cold efficiency of someone executing a decision that had already been made elsewhere, long before Aaliyah ever stepped onto the property. Clutching the small place card handed to her, Aaliyah made her way into the main hall. The opulence nearly blinded her. Tall glass ceilings glittering with crystal chandeliers, walls draped in cascading flowers, tables dressed in the finest linens. Every detail screamed of money, taste, and curated perfection. Yet, moving through it all, Aaliyah felt like a shadow. Across the room, she caught sight of her adoptive mother adjusting Emily's veil, fussing over her hair, whispering something that made Emily laugh and cling tighter to her. The moment was so tender, so naturally affectionate, that it carved a hollow deeper into Aaliyah's chest. Steeling herself, she approached. "Mom, could I speak to you for a second?" she asked, her voice low, careful not to disturb the tableau. Caroline didn't even glance at her. "Not now, Aaliyah. Can't you see we're busy?" "Just a moment," Aaliyah pressed, the place card trembling slightly in her fingers. Caroline sighed dramatically, giving Emily's shoulder a final pat before stepping aside. Emily remained where she was, arms crossed, watching Aaliyah with a smile that barely masked her disdain. "I was told I'm seated in the hallway," Aaliyah said quietly, feeling like a child again, daring to ask for something she knew she would not receive. Caroline shrugged as if it were of no consequence. "We had to prioritize close family, you understand?" "I am close family," Aaliyah said, her voice cracking despite her efforts. "Oh, Aaliyah, don't make a scene," Caroline said with a light, dismissive laugh. "You're always so sensitive." Emily chimed in, her voice saccharine. "I'm sure it was just a mix-up. Weddings are chaotic. Don't take it personally." But there was nothing chaotic about it. Aaliyah could see the careful design of it all, the deliberate exclusion, the silent message, "You don't belong here." Before Aaliyah could reply, her father Richard approached, wearing the same tight smile he reserved for unpleasant encounters. "It's just a seat, sweetheart. Let's not make it a thing." He didn't meet her eyes. Aaliyah stood there, burning from the inside out. Not with rage, no, it was colder, more settled. A realization that tightened around her ribs and made her breathing shallow. They would never see her, not really. She could straighten her hair, lighten her skin, mute herself into invisibility, and it would never be enough. Without another word, she turned and walked away, heels clicking softly against the polished marble. No one called her back. The hallway where she was seated smelled faintly of lemon polish and something more acrid, the tang of indifference. The folding chairs were neatly arranged, but the air was heavy with the weight of not being wanted. Aaliyah sat stiffly, her place card resting on her lap. The name was written in gold cursive, elegant and cruel. Her reflection in the window caught her eye. A lone figure wrapped in green silk, surrounded by white tablecloths and gold-rimmed glasses she would never be invited to touch. And still, a small, battered hope whispered inside her. Maybe someone would notice. Maybe someone would say something. But deep down, she already knew they wouldn't. They never had. The music swelled inside the hall, a cheerful waltz playing for the entrance of the newlyweds. Applause erupted like a wave crashing against the windows that separated her from the celebration. She sat motionless, holding the place card as if it might tether her to something real, something that once resembled a family. Outside the window, twilight began to fall, painting the sky in bruised purples and grays. It looked exactly like she felt, something beautiful, dimming into shadow. And still, she stayed seated, refusing to cry, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her crack. The night was just beginning. So was the reckoning. The next chapter of her life, she realized, would not be written by them. Not anymore. The music from the main hall pulsed faintly against the walls, muffled and distant, like a world operating just beyond her reach. Aaliyah sat motionless, her hands folded neatly in her lap, the place card lying forgotten on the small table beside her. Around her, the hallway felt both cavernous and suffocating, a liminal space where unwanted things were stored, coats, cleaning carts, and her. The celebration swirled on without her, untouched and undisturbed. After a long moment, she rose, smoothing the folds of her dress, and walked slowly back toward the banquet hall. She would not hide. She would not vanish. If they were determined to banish her to the margins, she would at least witness their perfection up close. Each step she took echoed lightly, a solitary rhythm against the grand marble floors. When she re-entered the hall, the spectacle struck her anew. It was like stepping into a living advertisement for old money elegance. Gilded chandeliers dripping with crystals, centerpieces of towering white orchids and roses, waiters gliding between tables with silver trays held aloft. The air smelled of expensive perfume, beeswax candles, and freshly baked brioche. Every detail had been curated with an obsessive devotion to appearances. The guests were equally polished. Women in pastel gowns with intricate beading, men in bespoke suits with silk pocket squares. All faces, bright, laughing, comfortable, belonged to the same pale tapestry. In this sea of ivory skin and honey hair, Aaliyah's presence was a rupture they could not quite smooth over, a ripple in the surface of their curated illusion. As she moved carefully along the perimeter, she caught glimpses of the seating arrangement. The head table, of course, sat on a raised dais under a golden archway decorated with cascading ivy and fairy lights. Richard and Caroline Monroe sat proudly beside Emily, beaming with the pride of a dynasty reaffirming itself. Flanking them were members of the inner circle, Emily's close friends, all blonde and smiling, and the family's most important business connections. Every name, every placement had been considered, weighed, measured for optics. Proximity to the bride equaled worth, and Aaliyah, by every visible measure, had been deemed unworthy. She paused by the doorway, feeling the weight of every dismissive glance brushing against her. No one said anything outright. No one needed to. The silence spoke louder than any words could have. It was a silence she had known all her life, threaded through birthday parties where she was photographed at the edge of the frame, through family Christmas cards where she was the single dark figure among a sea of light. Always included enough to maintain the illusion of kindness, never enough to truly belong. A memory flashed before her eyes. A summer afternoon, years ago, when Caroline had hosted a garden party for the local women's auxiliary. Aaliyah had worn a white sundress, the only black child among the sea of giggling blondes. Caroline had smiled tightly when Aaliyah approached the main group, then gently steered her away toward the lemonade stand, whispering that it's best to let the other girls bond. They have so much in common. At the time, Aaliyah had blamed herself. Maybe she wasn't charming enough, pretty enough, easy enough to love. Now, standing in the glittering hall among the perfect guests, she saw it clearly for what it had always been. Her steps carried her to a small alcove near the bar, where she could observe without obstructing the grand procession of toasts and dances. A waiter offered her champagne, and she accepted with a murmured thanks, though the glass trembled slightly in her hand. Across the room, Caroline laughed at something a guest had said, her hand resting lightly on Emily's arm. A gesture so intimate, so natural, that it momentarily froze Aaliyah's breath in her chest. She had never been touched like that by Caroline. Their interactions were always careful, measured. Pats on the shoulder, the occasional stiff hug at milestones that demanded a show of affection. Another memory drifted up, unbidden. Senior awards night at her high school. Aaliyah had been called up for academic excellence, a full-ride scholarship in hand, while Emily had only managed a minor recognition in theater. After the ceremony, Caroline had hugged Emily first, whispering how proud she was, how beautiful she looked under the stage lights. When Aaliyah approached, Caroline had smiled, said, "Good job," and moved on to speak with a neighbor. At the time, Aaliyah had convinced herself it didn't matter. Success was its own reward. But, standing there now, invisible at her sister's wedding, she realized it had mattered more than she had ever allowed herself to admit. She sipped the champagne, the bubbles burning slightly down her throat, and forced herself to keep watching. It was a form of mourning, she supposed, witnessing the final death of whatever fragile hopes she had harbored about this family. A ripple of applause broke through her thoughts. Emily and her new husband, Justin, were making their grand entrance, hand in hand, radiant under the soft lights. They moved effortlessly through the crowd, accepting congratulations, exchanging kisses on cheeks. Emily's dress, a confection of tulle and lace, floated behind her like a cloud. Her smile was blinding, rehearsed to perfection. Aaliyah wondered if anyone else saw the strain in Justin's jaw, the stiffness in his posture. Probably not. People saw what they wanted to see. The master of ceremonies called for the first dance, and the crowd dutifully circled the dance floor. Aaliyah remained at the edge, unnoticed, the way she always had been. As the music swelled, a syrupy ballad extolling eternal love, Caroline dabbed her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief, clutching Richard's hand. The perfect, proud parents. No one seemed to remember that another daughter stood just beyond the circle of light, watching from the margins. A heavy hand settled briefly on Aaliyah's shoulder, startling her. She turned to see her great-uncle Peter, red-faced from drink, smiling too broadly. "You've grown into a lovely young woman," he said loudly, enough that several nearby guests turned to look. "Your mama did a good thing, taking you in. Real Christian charity." The words hung in the air, thick and sour. Aaliyah smiled tightly and said nothing. What could she say? "Thank you for reminding me that I was a charity case, an obligation cloaked in benevolence." Peter patted her shoulder again and stumbled off toward the bar, leaving a wake of awkwardness behind him. A few guests glanced her way, their expressions ranging from pity to discomfort. No one intervened. No one ever did. She returned her gaze to the dance floor, the glass cold in her hand. For years she had tried to earn her place here. She had worked twice as hard, behaved twice as carefully, loved twice as fiercely, always hoping it would be enough. That if she just excelled, if she just endured, one day Caroline would look at her not with polite obligation but with genuine pride. That one day Emily would stop seeing her as a nuisance, a stain on an otherwise spotless canvas. But that day had never come, and tonight, under the glittering lights of a celebration that had no room for her, Aaliyah finally understood why. It had never been about what she did. It had always been about what she was. She could not scrub her skin lighter, could not sand down her features to fit their mold. Her very existence was a reminder of the family's inconvenient charity, their one deviation from the story they told about themselves. She was their secret, and secrets were meant to be hidden. The realization settled over her like a shroud, both heavy and strangely liberating. The band switched to an upbeat number, and the crowd surged onto the dance floor, laughing and clapping. Emily twirled, her dress spinning out in a perfect arc, her golden hair catching the light like a halo. Aaliyah watched for a moment longer, then turned away. She would not beg for a place at their table anymore. She would not cling to a family that had decided, long ago, that she was a guest in their story, never a true character. Her heart beat steadily as she made her way back toward the hallway, each step lighter than the last. She did not know what would come next, but for the first time in a long time, she knew it would not be defined by them. As she crossed the threshold into the quiet hallway, the muffled music fading behind her, she felt a strange sense of peace. They had tried to erase her, but she was still here, and she was not leaving quietly. The night was far from over, and the truth, long buried beneath layers of politeness and pretense, was stirring at last. The soft clinking of champagne glasses and distant strains of music from the main hall faded behind Aaliyah as she made her way deeper into the labyrinthine corridors of the estate. The walls were lined with ornate tapestries, each depicting idyllic scenes of white-clad maidens and golden-haired knights. It was almost laughably on the nose, she thought, this celebration of a history she would never be part of. Her footsteps fell silent on the thick, patterned carpets, her heels sinking slightly into the plush fabric. She wasn't entirely sure where she was going. She only knew she needed to get away from the glare of chandeliers and the polite smiles that sliced at her skin with 1,000 unseen cuts. The cool, quiet air of the side corridors wrapped around her like a balm, and for a brief moment she allowed herself the luxury of not pretending. Turning a corner, she found herself in a narrow service hallway. Here, the pretense of perfection fell away. Exposed pipes lined the ceiling, and faint scuff marks marred the baseboards. It was the estate's unseen skeleton, the backstage of their grand performance, and somehow it felt more honest than anything she had encountered all evening. She leaned against the wall, letting her head fall back with a soft thud against the cool plaster. She closed her eyes, allowing the murmur of distant voices to wash over her. It was safer here, in the spaces no one cared about. She could breathe here. It was then that she heard it, a sharp peal of laughter, too loud, too brittle. Aaliyah opened her eyes, frowning slightly. The laughter came from just around the corner, where a door to a service patio had been left slightly ajar. She could see the spill of warm light and the shifting shadows of figures beyond it. Curiosity, or maybe just some stubborn streak that refused to be erased, pulled her forward. She moved silently, her steps careful, and positioned herself near the door, out of sight, but close enough to hear. At first, the conversation was a blur of casual gossip, indistinct and meaningless. Then, a voice she recognized, Emily's, rose above the rest. "I swear," Emily said, her tone dripping with amusement, "if I have to see Aaliyah's face in one more family photo, I might actually scream." Another burst of laughter followed, high-pitched and cruel. "Seriously, Em," one of her friends chimed in, "your mom is like a saint for taking her in. Not everyone would have done that, you know." "Oh, believe me," Emily said, "it wasn't about kindness. It was all about appearances. Daddy's company was getting bad press about diversity, or whatever, back then. Taking Aaliyah in made them look like saviors." Aaliyah felt the words strike her like physical blows, each one digging deeper than the last. She pressed her hand against the wall to steady herself. "And look," Emily continued, "it's not like she's ungrateful. She just doesn't fit. Never has. And now, with everyone taking pictures tonight, the last thing I need is someone asking, "Oh, who's the dark one in the family portrait?" The friends tittered again, their laughter light and vicious. "It's better this way," Emily said with a dismissive shrug. "She'll stay in the background, where she belongs." Aaliyah felt something inside her, something brittle and precious, splinter and crack. Before she could move, before she could slip away unnoticed, another figure appeared at the edge of her vision. She caught a glimpse of dark hair, a tailored suit, and a face she recognized instantly. Justin. The groom himself stood frozen just beyond the patio doors, half hidden by the frame, his expression carved in stone. He had heard everything. His hand, holding a half-empty champagne flute, trembled slightly. His knuckles whitened around the stem of the glass. Aaliyah stared at him, unsure whether to feel vindicated or horrified. Part of her wanted to step back into the shadows, to let him process the ugly truth on his own. But another, fiercer part of her, the part that had spent a lifetime swallowing pain and forcing smiles, refused to look away. Their eyes met briefly, a silent exchange crackling in the charged air between them. Justin looked like a man who had been slapped awake from a dream he hadn't realized was a nightmare. His gaze darted back toward the patio where Emily and her friends continued to giggle, oblivious to the unraveling happening just feet away. Aaliyah could have walked away then. She could have left him to his heartbreak, to the shattering of illusions he had built around the perfect bride, the perfect life. But she found herself stepping forward instead. Not out of malice, not out of revenge, but because no one deserved to be deceived so completely by those they trusted most. Justin turned fully toward her as she approached, his face a mask of shock and dawning understanding. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He shook his head once, sharply, as if trying to clear it. Aaliyah reached him and stood there for a long moment, the unspoken words hanging heavy between them. "I guess congratulations are in order," she said finally, her voice low and steady, but devoid of bitterness. Justin gave a hollow laugh that quickly died in his throat. He glanced back toward the patio, where the laughter continued unabated, and then looked at Aaliyah again. Really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. "How long?" he asked, his voice rough. Aaliyah shrugged slightly. "Long enough." Justin's shoulders sagged under the weight of realization. He seemed older now, diminished somehow, as if the glossy facade he had worn so easily before had been stripped away. "I don't know what to do," he admitted, more to himself than to her. "You deserve to know the truth," Aaliyah said simply. "Whatever you decide after that is up to you." For a long moment they stood there, two figures displaced from the glittering world beyond the doors, bound together by a truth neither had asked for but could no longer ignore. Footsteps echoed down the hallway, and Aaliyah turned to see a tall, regal woman approaching. Justin's mother, Celeste Bennett. Her gown was a deep navy silk, severe and elegant, and her platinum hair was swept into an impeccable chignon. She carried herself with an air of command that made people instinctively step aside. Tonight, however, her face was clouded with something that looked almost like sorrow. "Justin," she said softly, her voice carrying effortlessly across the distance. He straightened at the sound of her voice, the lost boy fading back into the composed man. Celeste reached them and looked first at Justin, then at Aaliyah, her sharp eyes missing nothing. In her hand, she held a phone, the screen illuminated with messages Aaliyah couldn't see. "I think you should see this," Celeste said, her tone clipped and emotionless. She handed the phone to Justin, who took it with shaking hands. His eyes scanned the screen, and Aaliyah watched as his face drained of color. There were texts, long, damning threads of conversation between Emily and various friends and advisors. Texts about manipulating Justin, about securing her position within the Bennett family, about plans for a discreet divorce once the financial benefits had been secured. Words dripping with entitlement and cruelty. Justin's hand trembled visibly now, the phone tilting slightly as he struggled to process the betrayal laid out in cold, undeniable text. Aaliyah remained silent, her heart a tight, aching knot in her chest. She had spent her entire life being the silent witness to other people's cruelties, the unacknowledged casualty of polite prejudice. But tonight, she would not look away. Tonight, she would not pretend. Justin looked up, his eyes shining with something dangerously close to tears. "I loved her," he said, his voice breaking. "I know," Celeste said gently, placing a steadying hand on his arm. Justin looked back at Aaliyah, a question forming on his lips. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" Aaliyah met his gaze evenly. "Would you have believed me?" she asked. The answer was written plainly across his face. No, he wouldn't have. Not then. But now, standing on the threshold of a future built on lies, he could no longer afford the luxury of ignorance. The truth had found him, and it would not be denied. Neither would Aaliyah. The night was far from over, and neither was the reckoning it had begun. The air around them was thick, the kind of heavy, still atmosphere that comes right before a storm breaks. Justin stood with his head bowed, the phone still trembling slightly in his hand. Aaliyah remained where she was, her arms loosely at her sides, feeling the weight of what had just unfolded, yet knowing instinctively that this was only the beginning. Celeste's expression was unreadable as she studied her son, her hand firm on his arm like she was the only thing keeping him from crumbling onto the polished marble floor. Justin drew a slow, ragged breath and straightened his shoulders. The decision hardened behind his eyes, a sudden clarity slicing through the shock and betrayal that had frozen him before. He handed the phone back to his mother with a quiet murmur of thanks, his fingers brushing hers for just a moment longer than necessary, grounding himself. Then he turned to Aaliyah, his voice low but steady. "I need your help," he said simply. There were no elaborate explanations, no apologies, no polite qualifiers. Just the raw, unvarnished truth of a man who realized he had been a pawn in someone else's carefully constructed game, and who now sought, in whatever way he could, to reclaim his dignity. Aaliyah nodded once. She didn't need him to beg. She didn't need vindication. She had spent her whole life being forced to justify her place. Tonight, she would act without apology. Celeste checked her watch and spoke briskly. "We don't have much time. If we're going to do this, it has to happen before the toasts begin. After that, the entire crowd will be too entangled, and any disruption will look like hysteria." Her tone was so matter-of-fact that Aaliyah almost smiled. Celeste Bennett was not a woman who flinched from ugly truths. She confronted them with precision and efficiency, cutting them out like a surgeon removing rot before it could spread. A plan formed quickly between the three of them, spoken in low, urgent voices. Justin would request a private meeting with Emily and both sets of parents under the pretense of sharing a surprise announcement. Celeste would back him, lending authority that few in their social circle would dare to question. Aaliyah would come along, unexpected, silent, bearing witness, not just for herself, but for the truth. The meeting would happen in one of the estate's smaller reception rooms on the second floor, away from the crowds and cameras. Aaliyah's heart pounded steadily against her ribs, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had waited her entire life for this. Not for revenge, not for spectacle, but for a moment where she could finally stand fully in the light, seen and undeniable. Together, they moved back through the service corridors and re-entered the grand hall. The party was in full swing now, laughter ringing out, glasses clinking, guests flushed with wine and the easy intoxication of belonging. No one paid attention to the trio moving swiftly along the edges, their steps purposeful and sure. Justin approached Emily first. She stood near the head table, her hand curled possessively around the stem of a crystal flute, her cheeks flushed with triumph. When she saw Justin, her smile widened instinctively, only faltering slightly when she caught the rigid set of his jaw. Still, she tilted her head coquettishly and reached for him. Justin didn't react. His eyes, dark and fathomless now, didn't soften. "Can I steal you for a minute?" he asked, his voice calm, almost tender. Emily beamed, mistaking the gravity in his tone for romance. She nodded eagerly and followed him, motioning for Caroline and Richard Monroe to come along. Caroline looked briefly annoyed at being pulled away from her admiring circle, but she smoothed her expression and complied. As the small group moved toward the stairwell, Celeste intercepted a member of the waitstaff and murmured instructions. Within moments, 2 security personnel discreetly took positions near the entrances, ensuring that no uninvited guests would stumble into the coming confrontation. The climb up the staircase was silent, each step amplifying the tension that coiled tighter with every heartbeat. Aaliyah followed at a distance, her hands clenched into fists so tightly at her sides that her nails bit into her palms. She welcomed the sharpness of the sensation. It kept her focused, grounded. The reception room they entered was dimly lit, its mahogany-paneled walls lined with oil paintings of anonymous ancestors. A long table dominated the center, flanked by high-backed chairs. Justin moved to the head of the table and turned to face the group, his face a mask of composure. Emily perched delicately on one of the chairs, smoothing her dress and flashing him a radiant smile. Caroline and Richard sat across from her, exchanging puzzled glances. Celeste remained standing near the door, her arms folded across her chest, a silent sentinel. Aaliyah took her place near the window, the city lights winking distantly through the glass behind her. Justin cleared his throat, and the room stilled. "I want to start by saying," he began, his voice low and firm, "that this wasn't easy for me. Today was supposed to be the beginning of something beautiful, something built on trust." Emily's smile faltered slightly. "But trust," Justin continued, his gaze locking onto hers, "can't exist where there are lies." He pulled a white envelope from the inner pocket of his jacket and placed it deliberately on the table. Emily stared at it, a frown creasing her brow. Caroline leaned forward, suspicion darkening her features. "What is this?" Emily asked, her voice brittle. "Annulment papers," Justin said flatly, "signed and ready." For a long, terrible moment, no one moved. Then Caroline gasped, covering her mouth with one perfectly manicured hand. Richard stiffened visibly, his face flushing an ugly red. Emily laughed, high and shaky. "You're joking," she said, her eyes darting between Justin and her parents. "This is a joke." "No," Celeste said, her voice cutting clean through the air. "It's not." Justin reached into his pocket again and retrieved his phone. He tapped the screen a few times, then began reading aloud. 6 months after the wedding. Once the papers are filed, I'll be set. Justin's too easy to control. Play the sweet little wife until the estate transfers go through." Emily's face drained of color. Her hands gripped the edge of the chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. He continued, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I'm not wasting my life waiting for someone to grow a backbone. This is business, not love." Caroline let out a choked sob while Richard sat frozen, his fists clenched on his knees. Aaliyah watched it all unfold with a strange sense of detachment, as if she were witnessing a storm from a safe distance. Yet, beneath the surface, a deep, shuddering sadness stirred. Not because she pitied Emily, she didn't, but because she recognized all too well the rot that had been allowed to fester under the glossy surface of this family. Emily surged to her feet, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. "This is insane!" she cried, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. "You're ruining everything over some stupid texts." Justin's mouth twisted into a grimace that might once have been a smile. "No, Emily, you ruined it." He turned and walked toward the door, his steps slow but sure. Celeste followed without hesitation. Aaliyah lingered for a moment longer, meeting Emily's furious, desperate gaze. Without a word, she turned and walked out, leaving behind the wreckage of a fantasy that had never included her to begin with. The door swung shut behind her with a final, echoing click. The night was not over. Not yet. The truth was loose now, like a spark in a dry forest, and nothing could stop the fire that was coming. The door had barely clicked shut behind Aaliyah when a tremor passed through the grand hall below, subtle at first, like the first shuddering breath before a cry. In the hushed corridors of the estate, the reverberations of the confrontation upstairs were still invisible, but the tension was already beginning to seep through the walls, staining the pristine celebrations with an invisible crack. Aaliyah followed Celeste and Justin down the wide staircase, each step heavier than the last. The bright hum of laughter and music still filled the air, the guests blissfully unaware that the fantasy they had been invited to witness was already crumbling. Aaliyah kept slightly behind, her dress brushing against the banister, her heels soundless on the thick carpet. Her mind raced with everything that had been said, everything that had not needed to be said. For the first time in her life, she was not just surviving within the margins of this world. She was part of its unwinding. When they reached the base of the stairs, Justin paused, his hand tightening into a fist at his side. His face was pale, jaw clenched, but his steps were sure as he moved back into the throng of guests. Celeste fell into step beside him, a silent force of will, her presence commanding attention without a single word spoken. Aaliyah hesitated at the edge of the hall. She could have retreated then, melted back into the shadows as she had so many times before. But something deep within her, something fierce and long-caged, refused to allow it. She stepped forward, head high, refusing to be invisible. The master of ceremonies, oblivious to the gathering storm, tapped his microphone and called for the guests' attention. The music faded into a gentle hush. Faces turned towards the raised dais where Justin stood, his silhouette sharp against the cascade of white roses and golden lights. Emily, summoned by the motion, appeared from the side corridor, her face still tight with the remnants of their confrontation. Her steps were hesitant, her movements jerky, but she schooled her features into a brittle smile as she took her place beside him. Caroline and Richard slipped in behind her, their expressions strained. Their perfect evening was slipping through their fingers, and they knew it. Justin raised a hand, and the hall fell silent. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the room. Thank you for celebrating what was meant to be a beginning." A soft ripple of polite applause moved through the crowd. "But before we continue," he said, his voice hardening slightly, "there's something you all deserve to know." The tension in the room snapped taut. Murmurs buzzed like wasps. Aaliyah stood near a marble column, her heart thudding heavily against her ribs, feeling the undercurrent shift beneath their feet. Justin reached into his jacket once more and drew out the envelope, the same envelope he had laid before Emily upstairs. His hands were steady as he unfolded the papers inside, holding them up for all to see. "This," he said, "is an annulment agreement, effective immediately." Gasps broke out across the hall. A wave of confusion and shock rippled through the gathered guests. Heads turned, faces twisted in disbelief. The musicians at the side of the room lowered their instruments, exchanging bewildered glances. Emily's smile faltered, her mask slipping. She took an involuntary step toward Justin, her hand outstretched. "Justin, please," she whispered, the microphone picking up the tremor in her voice. But Justin stepped back, his face impassive. "Before you judge," he said, turning to the guests, "I want you to understand why." He read aloud from his phone, the same messages Celeste had shown him upstairs. The words fell into the stunned silence like stones dropped into a still pond, each splash sending shockwaves through the crowd, plans for manipulation, calculations about money and status, cold, ruthless disdain for the very man Emily had pledged to love just hours earlier. The ballroom, so recently filled with laughter and music, now thrummed with the heavy, stunned weight of betrayal. Emily's face crumpled. Tears welled in her eyes, smudging her meticulously applied makeup. She turned to her parents, pleading silently for support. But Caroline's face was ashen, her hands fluttering uselessly in front of her chest. Richard stood stiff and unreadable, a pillar crumbling from within. "It's not true," Emily cried, her voice cracking. "They're twisting everything. It was just jokes between friends." Celeste stepped forward then, her presence slicing cleanly through Emily's desperate words. "And the divorce papers you filed last month?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying despite its softness. Another murmur rippled through the room. Eyes turned toward Emily, narrowing, judging. "I didn't mean it," Emily wailed. "I was scared. I didn't know if he really loved me." Her words stumbled over each other, thin and frantic, dissolving into the heavy, humid air. Justin shook his head slowly, almost sadly. "Love built on lies isn't love," he said simply. The guests, sensing the inevitability of the collapse, began to shift uncomfortably. Some looked away, unable to meet the rawness of the moment. Others watched avidly, faces alight with the cruel fascination of witnessing someone else's fall. Aaliyah stayed where she was, her hands relaxed at her sides, her body still. She watched Emily unravel, strand by strand, watched the careful construction of perfection crumble into ash. For a fleeting moment, Emily's gaze found Aaliyah's across the room. In her eyes blazed something wild, something unhinged, a desperate, clawing need to find someone, anyone, to blame. "You!" Emily screamed, pointing across the room. "This is your fault. You've always been jealous of me. You've always wanted to destroy me." Heads turned. A fresh ripple of whispers flowed through the crowd. Aaliyah did not flinch. She stood her ground, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable. "I don't need to destroy anyone," Aaliyah said, her voice calm, clear, and unshakable. "The truth speaks for itself." For a moment, Emily stood frozen, her hand still outstretched, her chest heaving. Then, slowly, the realization dawned. The guests were not rushing to her defense. Her parents were not stepping forward to shield her. She was alone. Truly, completely alone. Her arms dropped to her sides and a guttural sob tore from her throat. She stumbled back, turning blindly, pushing through the crowd, her pristine white gown snagged on the edge of a chair, tearing the delicate lace. She didn't stop. She shoved open the heavy doors and fled into the night, her cries echoing down the empty corridors. Silence filled the space she left behind, heavy and impenetrable. Justin lowered the microphone and stepped down from the dais. Celeste was at his side instantly, her hand light on his arm, guiding him through the sea of stunned faces. Aaliyah remained for a moment longer, surveying the wreckage. She felt no triumph, only a quiet, aching sort of sadness, for all the lies they had told, for all the truths they had buried, for the broken shards of a family that had never truly been whole. She turned and walked after Justin and Celeste, leaving the glittering devastation behind her. The night outside was cool and crisp, the sky stretched wide and dark overhead, studded with stars. The sounds of the party behind them were muted now, a distant, irrelevant echo. Justin stood by the edge of the courtyard, staring up at the sky. His face was illuminated by the soft glow of the lamps lining the path, the lines of pain and betrayal etched deep into his features. "I'm sorry," he said when he heard Aaliyah approach. His voice was low, rough with emotion. "For everything. For not seeing." Aaliyah shook her head slowly. "You're not the only one who didn't see," she said. "I spent years believing that if I just tried hard enough, loved hard enough, I could belong. But you can't force people to see you when they don't want to." He turned to her, his eyes filled with something like gratitude, and something more complicated, something that might one day become understanding. "Thank you," he said simply. She nodded once, accepting it without ceremony. They stood there for a while, two unlikely allies under the indifferent stars, each silently mourning what they had lost and wondering, perhaps, what they might still find. Inside, the band struck up another song, desperate to salvage what remained of the night. But out here, in the cool, honest darkness, there were no more illusions. Only the truth, and the beginning of something new. The night air was cool against Aaliyah's skin as she stood at the threshold between the glittering ruins of the reception hall and the vast, indifferent darkness beyond. For a long moment, she hesitated, letting the breeze wrap around her like a silent witness to everything that had unfolded. Behind her, the music had resumed, a brittle, desperate melody trying to mend the irreparable. The laughter that once filled the air had thinned, replaced by a strained murmur of confusion and speculation. Inside the hall, the remaining guests were beginning to stir, their movements hesitant, uncertain. The perfect image they had come to celebrate had shattered, and now they stood among its broken pieces, unsure where to step without cutting themselves on the sharp edges of exposed truth. Aaliyah could feel the shift, the way the crowd's gaze had begun to turn inward, the polite smiles giving way to suspicion, to whispered judgments. They were recalibrating, reassessing their alliances, deciding how much of Emily's fall they had seen coming and how much they could claim ignorance of. Aaliyah watched them for a moment longer, then turned her eyes toward the grand staircase. Emily had not reappeared. Her flight through the heavy double doors had left behind a vacuum, a gaping absence that none of the remaining guests dared to acknowledge too openly. For all her careful construction, Emily had underestimated one truth. When the center collapses, the outer rings do not rush in to save it. They scatter to save themselves. From the far side of the room, Caroline Monroe appeared, moving with mechanical grace as she tried to gather some semblance of order. She spoke to small clusters of guests, her smile brittle, her hands fluttering like moths caught in a jar. Richard followed her at a distance, his face a blank mask. It was clear that the family's veneer of control was cracking, and no amount of social performance could repair it. Near the dais, the remnants of the wedding cake still stood, its elaborate sugar flowers wilting under the heat of the lights. Aaliyah found herself drifting toward it, drawn by some morbid curiosity. She studied the carefully piped white icing, the gold leaf accents, the figurines perched atop the highest tier, a blonde bride and a dark-haired groom frozen forever in a mockery of union. It struck her then, with a clarity so sharp it almost made her laugh, that everything about this night had been an illusion. Not just the marriage, but the very idea of unity, of acceptance. The family had built a kingdom on sand, on appearances, and now the tide was coming in. Movement at the back of the hall caught her eye. The double doors Emily had fled through stood ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze. Beyond them, the night stretched out, empty and uncaring. And there, framed in the doorway, Emily reappeared. For a moment, no one noticed her. The guests continued their low conversations, their stolen glances, but slowly, as if drawn by an invisible thread, heads began to turn. Emily stood motionless, her once pristine gown stained and torn at the hem, her veil trailing behind her like a ghost. Her hair had come loose from its careful style, and the tears streaking her makeup had carved dark rivulets down her cheeks. She looked nothing like the radiant bride who had floated down the aisle hours earlier. She looked feral, undone. Her chest rose and fell in ragged breaths as she took a single step into the hall. The music faltered, stumbled, then died. Silence fell like a guillotine. Emily's eyes swept the room, wild and desperate, searching for something, someone, to anchor her. But she found only wide-eyed stares and backs turning away. Even her closest friends, the ones who had clung to her laughter and basked in her glow, edged away now, unwilling to be associated with her ruin. It took only seconds for the full weight of her isolation to crash down upon her. "You think you can humiliate me?" she screamed, her voice cracking under the strain. The words echoed off the marble floors and vaulted ceilings, harsh and jarring against the oppressive silence. "After everything I've done for this family, for this day?" No one answered. No one moved. Emily stumbled forward, her hands balled into fists at her sides. "I built this," she shrieked. "I made this happen. You think any of you would be here without me?" Still no response. The crowd held its collective breath, unwilling to risk entanglement. Her gaze landed on Justin, who stood near the back of the hall, Celeste at his side. He watched her with a calm, impassive expression. Not anger, not pity. Simply the cold finality of someone who had closed a door forever. "I love you," Emily cried, her voice breaking entirely. "I did everything for us." Justin said nothing. He didn't need to. Celeste stepped slightly forward, her posture regal, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "You did everything for yourself, Emily. And now you're standing in the world you built." The words hit with the force of a physical blow. Emily staggered back a step, her face crumpling. She turned again, frantically scanning the room for an ally, a sympathetic face. Her eyes landed on Caroline and Richard, her parents, her creators. But they too stood frozen, horror and shame etched into their features. They made no move to reach for her, to protect her. It was, perhaps, the final betrayal. Aaliyah watched it all unfold, feeling a strange mixture of sorrow and vindication. She had spent so long believing she needed this family's approval to have worth. Watching Emily now, abandoned by the very people she had trusted to shield her, Aaliyah realized that she had been free all along. She had just never allowed herself to see it. Emily's sobs filled the hall, raw and unfiltered. She clutched at her dress, tearing at the delicate lace, as if by destroying the outward symbols of her perfection, she could somehow undo the collapse of everything beneath. Without thinking, Aaliyah took a step forward, not to comfort, not to rescue, but to stand witness. Because Emily's fall was not just hers. It was the collapse of an entire structure built on exclusion, on silent cruelty, on the belief that appearances could mask rot. Emily caught sight of her and bared her teeth in a snarl. "You wanted this," she spat. "You always hated me. You were always jealous, always trying to steal what was mine." Aaliyah stood tall, her face calm. "I never wanted what you had," she said quietly, her voice carrying easily through the stunned hall. "I just wanted to be seen." The simplicity of the statement cut deeper than any accusation could have. Emily let out a wordless cry and turned, fleeing once more through the open doors, disappearing into the night. The silence that followed was absolute. For a long moment, no one moved, no one spoke. Then, slowly, conversations resumed, tentative and hushed. Guests began to gather their things, to make polite excuses, to slip away into the darkness beyond the estate. The celebration was over. Only the wreckage remained. Aaliyah stood alone in the center of the hall, the remnants of the night's illusions scattered around her. She felt no triumph, no exultation, only a profound, aching clarity. She had spent her life on the outside, knocking at doors that would never open. Tonight, those doors had collapsed, revealing nothing behind them but empty rooms. And in that emptiness, she found freedom. As she turned and walked away from the glittering wreckage, she carried no bitterness with her. Only the quiet, steady knowledge that she had survived, that she had seen the truth, had spoken it, and had refused to let it be buried again. The night air was cool and sharp as she stepped outside. The sky stretched wide and endless above her, the stars burning with silent, indifferent brilliance. Somewhere beyond the hills, the first light of dawn was beginning to creep over the horizon. And Aaliyah, for the first time in her life, walked toward it without looking back. The first breath of morning touched Aaliyah's skin as she stepped out onto the empty driveway of the estate, the faintest glow of dawn softening the sharp edges of the night. The grand facade of the Hawthorne Lake estate, with its endless windows and sprawling stone terraces, loomed behind her, but it already felt like a relic of another life. Each step she took away from it seemed to loosen the invisible cords that had once tethered her there, cords woven from obligation, guilt, and the desperate, aching need to belong. She paused by the low stone wall at the edge of the property, resting her hand lightly against its rough surface. Beyond it, the landscape unrolled in misty fields and shadowed woods, untouched by the chaos that had unfolded within those polished marble halls. Out here, the world was vast and indifferent, offering no judgment, no expectation. It simply was. Aaliyah closed her eyes and inhaled deeply. The air was cool and clean, carrying the faint scent of pine and distant rain. She let it fill her lungs, let it anchor her in the present. No longer a guest at a party that had never truly welcomed her, no longer the silent, invisible daughter trying to mold herself into a place she was never meant to fit. Behind her, the estate was stirring again. She could hear the faint creak of doors, the soft murmur of staff beginning the long work of cleaning up the ruins of the night before. In a few hours, the debris would be swept away, the broken glasses replaced, the torn banners mended or discarded. The Monroes would smile politely for the photographers who would inevitably appear, spinning careful stories of unexpected changes, of resilience and grace under pressure. But no amount of careful framing could erase the truth now. The fractures ran too deep, the rot too visible. Aaliyah had no intention of staying to watch them try. She walked to the valet station, where a sleepy young attendant blinked at her in confusion before hurrying to retrieve her car. It arrived moments later, a modest sedan that looked almost comically out of place among the sleek black town cars and gleaming luxury vehicles. Aaliyah didn't care. She slid into the driver's seat, closed the door firmly behind her, and started the engine. As she pulled away from the estate, she didn't look back. The road wound away through the hills, each curve carrying her farther from the weight of the past. The sky was lightening quickly now, streaked with pale gold and soft violet, and the world felt wide and unfinished, a blank page waiting to be written upon. When she reached the main highway, her phone buzzed where it lay on the passenger seat. Aaliyah glanced at it, unsurprised to see Caroline's name flashing across the screen. She let it ring, then silenced it with a flick of her thumb. A minute later, another call came, this time from Richard. She ignored it as well. There was nothing left to say. Her fingers tightened briefly on the steering wheel as a flood of memories surged up. The countless times she had sat in the back seat of their car, dressed carefully for family functions, rehearsing polite conversation topics in her mind, willing herself to be pleasant, uncontroversial, acceptable. Always careful, always grateful, always slightly apart. No more. At a gas station on the edge of a sleepy town, Aaliyah pulled into a parking spot and turned off the engine. She sat for a moment, letting the silence settle around her. The sun had risen fully now, casting long, clean shadows across the asphalt. She reached for her phone, not to check missed calls, but to open her notes app. A few days ago, in a fit of quiet desperation, she had started a list titled simply, Things I Want. The list was short. At the top was freedom, beneath it, peace, truth, and, in a shaky tentative scrawl, to belong somewhere without having to shrink myself. She stared at the words for a long moment, then smiled softly. Without hesitating, she added a new entry, to choose myself. It was such a simple thing. And yet, it felt like the bravest act she had ever committed. Aaliyah tucked the phone back into her bag and stepped out of the car. She stretched her arms overhead, feeling the stiffness in her shoulders begin to ease. In the distance, the mountains rose, their peaks still shrouded in mist. They looked ancient and unmoving, indifferent to the dramas unfolding in the human world below. She had no plan. Not yet. No mapped-out destination or 5-year strategy, only the knowledge that she was free to choose her next step without anyone else's permission. And that was enough. Inside the gas station, she bought a cheap map, the kind printed on flimsy paper that would tear easily if you weren't careful. She spread it out on the hood of her car, tracing the roads and highways with her finger. Somewhere along the coast, perhaps, or maybe north, toward the mountains. Maine had always whispered to her, in the quiet moments when dreams were allowed to surface. The rocky shores, the lighthouses standing sentinel against the endless churn of the ocean. A place where she could be anonymous, where the expectations and judgments of others would fall away like old skin. She folded the map with care and climbed back into the car. As she drove, the miles slipping steadily behind her, Aaliyah let herself remember. Not the bitter memories, the slights, the exclusions, the casual cruelties, but the moments when she had been most herself. The afternoon spent sketching under the old oak tree behind the house, where no one cared if her hands were stained with charcoal. The nights lying awake, whispering stories into the dark, inventing worlds where she was the heroine of her own tale, not a footnote in someone else's. Those memories were hers, untouched, unruined. The road stretched out ahead, shimmering under the rising sun. Fields gave way to forests and forests to small towns, each one a possibility, a doorway into a life unshaped by the expectations of others. Her phone buzzed again, a text this time. It was short, from Richard. "Please call us. We need to talk." Aaliyah turned the phone face down on the seat. She didn't hate them. She wasn't interested in revenge or in endless rehashings of old wounds. She simply didn't owe them her life anymore. She didn't owe them her silence, her obedience, her presence at gatherings where she was always almost but not quite part of the family portrait. Freedom was not a dramatic declaration or a single cathartic act. It was a series of small choices, quiet and steadfast, made every day. She chose not to answer. She chose not to return. By the time she reached the coast, the sun was high and fierce, glinting off the steel-gray waters of the Atlantic. She found a small inn tucked against the cliffs, its white shutters weathered by salt and wind. The woman at the front desk smiled without reservation when Aaliyah walked in, her dark skin and weary eyes earning no second glances, no polite, brittle reassurances. Just a simple, genuine welcome. She booked a room for a week. After unpacking her small suitcase, carefully folding her dresses into the wardrobe, lining her books on the nightstand, she stepped outside and made her way down the winding path to the beach. The ocean roared in her ears, wild and ungovernable. The rocks were slick beneath her shoes, the wind sharp and salt-laden. She climbed out onto one of the larger boulders and sat, pulling her knees to her chest. For a long time, she simply watched the water, letting its relentless, indifferent rhythm soothe the ache she hadn't realized she was carrying. There would be grief, she knew. Grief for what could have been, for what had been lost before she even had the chance to fight for it. Grief for the family that had never truly been hers. But there would also be joy, the quiet, fierce joy of building a life where she could be fully, unapologetically herself. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the beach. Aaliyah closed her eyes and breathed deeply, tasting the salt on the air. She thought of the girl she had been, the girl standing on the edges of every room, waiting for someone to see her, to claim her. And she thought of the woman she was becoming, the woman who no longer needed anyone's permission to exist, to matter, to be free. When she opened her eyes again, the horizon stretched wide before her, limitless and waiting. She smiled, not for anyone else's benefit, but for herself. Then she stood, brushed the sand from her dress, and began walking along the shore, each step carving a new path into the untouched sand. The future was hers now, and for the first time in her life, she didn't have to ask to be part of it. She already was. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out the next video and explore other stories on the channel. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, share it with them.